Richard II, I often hold up as an example of why cousins shouldn't marry.
Things are starting to go wrong.
It's probably not good for a child to be treated like the Messiah under the age of 12.
His general attitude to war is bored now. Don't want to. Richard has misunderstood the entire project of his kingship.
From 1377 to 1422, England's fortunes waxed and waned as three dramatically different men wore its crown. The deluded narcissist, Richard II, the charismatic usurper, Henry IV, and the lionised warrior, Henry V. In this three-part History Extra podcast series, best-selling authors and historians Helen Castor and Dan Jones sat down to chart the reigns of these three rulers and explore how they shaped England, from the Peasants' Revolt to the Battle of Agincourt. Helen's new book, The Eagle in the Heart, follows the tangled stories of Richard II and Henry IV, while in his new book, Henry V, Dan Jones profiles the next king to sit on the throne. In this first episode, they begin with one of England's most controversial kings, Richard II.
Richard II, I often hold up as an example of why cousins shouldn't marry. Could you tell us a little bit about Richard's parents, where he came from, and maybe how that led to him turning out to be quite so weird?
What a question. Richard's parents were pretty unusual when it came to royal marriages in the Middle Ages, because his father, the Black Prince, as we know him, was the heir to the throne, but normally you'd expect an heir to the throne to have a bride found for him pretty quick. The Black Prince didn't get married until he was past 30, and when he did, he married his first cousin once removed, Joan of Kent, with whom he'd grown up, a very, very beautiful woman, but very closely related to him, and not a great diplomatic marriage among the royal families of Europe. Even more unusually, she'd been married before. Really, really odd for a bride of the heir to the throne to already have a first family and a colourful marital history. She'd been married off at 12, and then 7 years later had said, actually, I'm not married to the Earl of Salisbury. I'm married to this rather handsome soldier over here. It was all a bit dodgy, but the king helped her smooth everything out with some papal permissions. She moved on to her second marriage, had 4 children, and when he died, married the Prince of Wales. This is unheard of.
This is a very unusual situation. And I suppose if people think about later medieval history, a marriage like this, an unconventional royal marriage, they might think of Edward IV marrying Elizabeth Woodville, which created an enormous amount of hoo-ha and political disruption within England. It didn't seem to me, when I read your brilliant new book about Richard II and Henry IV, The Eagle in the Heart, it didn't seem to me that this did cause the same sort of disruption that we see later in the 15th century. Why do you think that was?
It caused raised eyebrows in England and all the way across Europe, because Joan was a bit of a scandalous figure, known as the Virgin of Kent, and
sarcastic.
That
right?
was meant sarcastically. Okay. But no, it didn't cause political ructions. It didn't cause controversy of a political kind. I think largely because Edward III, the Black Prince's father, was such an overwhelmingly powerful king, and a very indulgent father, one who was prepared to condone this rather unusual emotional romance and smooth everything over, really, for this spoiled pair who were going to get whatever they wanted.
Let's set the political scene, since you mentioned Edward III. Richard II's grandfather, a very different legacy to Richard II. Even in his own time, Edward III was regarded as, in some ways, the acme of kingship, the most successful of the English medieval kings, certainly in living memory. What was the state of England towards the end of Edward III's reign? What had happened, and which bit of the Middle Ages are we in, if you like?
We're in the middle of what we know as the 100 Years' War. What's crucial to remember, though, is that they didn't know it was the 100 Years' War, and they didn't know they were in the middle of it. What they knew was that the war had been going on for decades, It had been enormously successful for decades. England had won fantastic victories, captured the King of France, captured the King of Scotland, great battles at Crécy and Poitiers. But by the 1360s, which is when Richard is born in 1367, things are starting to go wrong. Edward is getting old, he's getting ill, and Richard's father, the Black Prince, is also getting ill. So there's a real sense of gathering storm clouds, gathering crisis. And the huge problem is by the 1370s that it's clear the Black Prince is not going to survive. And if the Black Prince is not going to survive, then the next king is going to be a child, because Richard is he's under 10. And that's not going to be a good thing when you have a war going on.
And the precedent for minorities in Plantagenet England at this point is relatively slight, isn't it? I mean, Edward III had come to the throne aged 14, 15, but had really not taken power until he seized it for himself in the coup in 1330, by which time he was on the cusp of adulthood and certainly acting like an adult. I suppose the last king to have been underage was Henry III, and that didn't bode particularly well for the future of England.
It didn't. Henry had turned out to be a very long-lasting king, but not a particularly successful one. But the English political community was investing a lot in the idea of Richard, particularly because as something to cling on to, really. When the Black Prince died, Richard was brought into Parliament and introduced as a prince being sent by the king, just as God sent his only beloved son to the world. So here Edward III is sending young Richard. So everyone there knew that was a metaphor designed to try and bind people together, apart from the 10-year-old boy who was being described as the Messiah in his own hearing. I don't think that was a very good idea in retrospect.
It's very hard, of course, to psychoanalyze people across history, particularly in the Middle Ages, although I think it's still often worth trying at least. It's probably not good for a child to be treated like the Messiah under the age of 12, in the same way that today we would suggest it would be a bad idea to give them a smartphone. This, of course, has more serious repercussions with Richard. And what we see throughout his life, and I think you capture this brilliantly in your book, is a total disjuncture, a rupture between his perception of what kingship is supposed to be about, which seems to track back to this idea that he's been told he was the Messiah as a child, and everybody else's perception of what kingship should be about. Tell us a little bit about Richard's becoming king and then his teenage years.
He became king in the end in the summer of 1377 at the age of 10 and a half, having already heard that he was the Messiah, having been brought up wrapped in cotton wool as the pampered baby of this slightly strange, large family. But he was his mother's baby, he was the baby of the whole family, and really cocooned in a household arranged around his specialness. Then he goes through a coronation in which he's anointed, set apart from all other people by the touch of the holy chrism, the holy oil. And then at 14, just 4 years later, the Peasants' Revolt erupts. We really need you to tell us about this. But these are thousands of rebels descending on London, calling the government corrupt, particularly angry with Richard's most powerful uncle, John of Gaunt, who's been trying to hold the whole country together during Richard's childhood. But the rebels are looking to one person to save them. They think the whole government is terrible, it's corrupt, it needs to be taken to pieces, but it's the king who will save them. So they have a password as they're gathering on the road to London. With whom hold you? They are asking everyone who goes past them. And the correct answer is with King Richard and the true commons. So Richard has this extraordinary experience at the age of 14 of coming face to face with rebels who want his kingdom of England to be ruled better, and they're looking to him to do it. And he looks around himself at the great nobles and he thinks, well, why are they running my government when it should be mine? But he sees it all in terms of rights, his rights, the things he should be being allowed to do, his will that is being thwarted. And what he's not seeing is that it's a matter of responsibilities. He's not understanding that in the slightest.
I wonder if it's worth pausing just very briefly here and trying to sketch out what is expected of a medieval king, because really part of the story, in fact, the whole story of Richard's reign is this fatal misunderstanding of what kingship is supposed to be about. This is the topic of entire careers, so maybe it's unfair trying to ask you to sum it up in about a minute, but what at the end of the 14th century, what do people want from the King of England? Is it absolutism? Is it a sort of constitutional monarchy? What are they after?
In a way, it's not that difficult to sum up, actually. The contemporary understanding is that the king has been given his authority by God in order to protect and defend his kingdom. And you can see what that means if you look at the royal seal. On one side is an image of the king on horseback with the sword unsheathed. He's got to defend his kingdom in a literal sense against attack from outside. On the other side is an image of the king sitting on his throne with a scepter. He's got to be a lawgiver. He's got to protect his people within the realm by enforcing the law and providing justice. In other words, stopping a descent into anarchy where the only way you can protect yourself is by beating up your neighbour. You want some kind of system of order, some kind of structure that's going to be provided by the king's law. So the king has an enormous amount of power as long as he's going to do those two things. The complication being, in the 1370s and on into the 1380s, that there is a war going on with France, and it's not going well. In previous decades, most of that war has been fought on French soil, which means it handily does two jobs at once. It defends the realm by pushing the fighting overseas. England is protected if all the soldiers are fighting over there. And it's also a matter of England winning great victories. So the country is united under the leadership of the king because spoils of war are being won. And Edward, Richard's grandfather, is also listening to grievances that come up at home. And if problems are coming up in the administration of justice, he's doing something about it. Richard doesn't see any of that. Richard sees complaints coming up in his parliaments as an attack on his own God-given authority. He sees criticism as unjustified, and when that criticism takes the form, as it does by 1386, of, "Oh my God, sire, there's a huge French fleet massing just over there and they're about to invade," Richard hears that not as, "Oh my God, invasion about to happen," but "How dare you criticise my ministers and my crown?" It seems almost unbelievable when you put it that way, but that is literally what happens in the autumn of 1386.
Was he very interested in fighting? I mean, in some aspects, as you rightly say, you can boil down medieval kingship to something relatively simple, and one of the essentials of it is you must be a leader in war, right? You must basically like to go and fight. His grandfather Edward III had been a great general commander. The Black Prince had been a great general commander. Is it as simple as the fact that Richard just doesn't like fighting? He's a lover, not a fighter. Well, is he even a lover?
Is he even a lover? But he certainly doesn't want to fight. He has no interest in fighting at all. Now, that might have been manageable. I mean, there were kings in the Middle Ages who were not great warriors, but as long as you engage with what the war is about and the fact that you need a strategy, you can send other people. If you've got better generals, you can send them in to fight for you, as long as you are the mastermind behind the front line, making sure that your kingdom's interests are being pursued and protected. The problem with Richard is his general attitude to war is bored now. Don't want to.
So what does he like doing?
He likes being majestic, which he sees in terms
Nothing
of
wrong with that.
Beautiful clothes and a lot of bowing and scraping around him. He likes spending time with the very small number of young men who have been his companions in his household since his childhood. Principal among them, a young man called Robert de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, who's 5 years older than him, and of whom one chronicler says if de Vere said black was white, Richard wouldn't contradict him. And he's the only person in the world of whom that's true. And at the point in 1386 when this French armada, it's not an exaggeration to use that word of this fleet, is massing, and London is in panic at the prospect of an imminent siege. It's collecting stockpiles of food. Richard and De Vere are more or less riding in the opposite direction because he's decided to give De Vere Ireland as dominion to play with, more or less, and has to be forcibly brought back to deal with the crisis where it's actually happening, sort of in the Channel and the North Sea.
This is unsustainable for a king of England to be so devoid of understanding of the job, so unwilling to do the basics. And we see this throughout the Plantagenet era. So obsessed with inappropriate or unhelpful favourites. This has been one of the stories of Edward II's reign. Things come to a head in 1386, 1387. I wonder if you can tell us about the process by which the English polity, the political community, try and drag Richard into some semblance of order.
First thing we have to know is that John of Gaunt has gone away. He is off in Spain attempting to become the King of Castile. Long story, but he's married a claimant to the throne. So he's out of the picture. And in his absence, Richard's youngest uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, the Duke of Gloucester, feels that he should be the one to step up and lead the country in trying to resist this French attack. So he's the one who steps up to tell Richard what's what, and that really he needs to pay attention and get with the programme. Woodstock is a tricky character. He has sort of been stranded between generations, thinks he should have been much more important and powerful than he actually is for a long time. So in a way, this is his moment to seize, but therefore he goes in with both feet. And that goes down extraordinarily badly with Richard, who tells him that at his parliament's request, he wouldn't even dismiss a scullion from his kitchen. So clearly this is going to be a standoff. Parliament enforces a change in the regime, a change in the administration, puts a council in place to deal with the invasion, to deal with everything that's been going wrong in the administration. And Richard more or less flounces off for a year, takes his household off around the country, and while he's there, talks to some of his judges and basically gets them to say that everything the Parliament has just done should be treated as treason, that anyone who makes or even persuades the king to do something he doesn't want to should be treated as a traitor. Now, if that is allowed to stand, what Richard has just done is turn an immediate crisis about an invasion scare and policy, into something even bigger. The whole nature of the relationship between the king and his people is at risk of being taken to pieces. If the king can now say at will, you talked me into doing that, I didn't want to, you're a traitor, because that means he can destroy any of his people with a click of his fingers. And the confrontation then in 1387, 1388 becomes something much bigger and even deeper and darker.
Are there any winners in this conflict? I mean, what is the outcome of this big political crisis?
Not really any winners. It's not a situation that's really susceptible of winners, and that's what Richard hasn't seen. That it actually would strengthen what his grandfather had known, is that it would strengthen his crown if you cooperate with your people. That's how you become more powerful. Richard is tearing everything apart. He's almost deposed at one point in the winter of 1387, 1388. They just can't decide who should take the crown in his place. And at this point, there are a group of 5 lords leading the opposition to him, including now Richard's cousin Henry. Gaunt, his father, being out of the country. Henry is stepping up to try and defend what he thinks the interests of the kingdom and the interests of his own dynasty are. A parliament takes place in the early spring of 1388, in which various of the people around Richard are executed, destroyed. De Vere has fled. So Richard is really at a very, very low ebb, power taken out of his hands, but it's not sustainable for the lords to govern for him, because that's not how kingship works. So by 1389, you've had this horrendous bloody crisis where the opponents to Richard have really gone much further than they have any right to. Richard has been put in his place and has had to take it, but that's an unnerving position to be in for the future. He's only 2021. Is he going to learn his lesson? Is he going to be a reformed character? What does the future hold? There's a very uneasy peace by 1389 when John of Gaunt comes back, having been the most unpopular nobleman in England when he left in 1386, welcomed back, everything having got so much worse while he was away, welcomed back as an elder statesman who helps patch everything back together. And a very uneasy peace reigns for a few years after that really destructive crisis.
Typically, when we look at the story of Richard II's reign, there is this big moment of crisis, 86, 87, 88, and then a sort of what looks like a lull before things erupt again in 1397, and that bit very familiar from Shakespeare. What's going on in those 10 years? Because sometimes this reign is played that sort of Richard takes his medicine, sits, broods for a while, and just waits until he has the chance for revenge. How do you see this part of the reign?
It's a very, very interesting few years, and you have to look quite closely to see what's going on. The big political story that I think gets missed because of these domestic crises is the story of what's going to happen in the war. It's become clear that trying to keep fighting in the way that Edward III had done is really not viable. It's costing too much money. The king doesn't want to. How are England and France going to get out of this sort of stalemate that the war has descended into? It's clear that Richard wants peace, but Richard isn't interested in detail ever about anything. So John of Gaunt is wearing his fingers to the bone, trying to find a way towards a treaty that might actually settle the issues between England and France once and for all. But it's tricky on two fronts. One is that there is no settlement to be found, really. The issues are too deep and too intractable about the lands that England holds in France, how, or thinks it ought to hold in France, does and thinks it ought to hold more. How is that going to be reconciled with the authority of the French king? There is no easy or even possible peace. At the same time, lots of people in England, including Thomas of Woodstock, the king's youngest uncle, don't want to stop fighting. They see it as shameful. So it's a very, very, very difficult process. Meanwhile, Richard is trying to get his favourite De Vere back, but he's also got ideas of his own. He decides to lead, in inverted commas, an expedition to Ireland in 1394-95. If he can't follow in his father and grandfather's footsteps in France, then he'll do something different. And what appeals to him about Ireland is that it's a dominion that no English king has been to since King John back in the late 12th, early 13th century. And his plan there is essentially to get all the lords of Ireland, whether the Anglo-Irish lords or the Gaelic Irish lords, to bow down before him. And that goes quite nicely from his point of view. So, he's got various plans afoot, getting the City of London slapped into line because it's been uppity and it's not been loaning him money. But the key to moving forward for him, if you can't have a permanent peace with France, at least get a treaty. And in 1396, he manages, at his own version of the Field of the Cloth of Gold, to arrange a treaty that will last, in effect, for 30 years, which, again, in Richard's terms, is long enough because he's not really a forward planner. Peace for now will do, which he achieves by marrying the daughter of the King of France, who is 6.
Yes. A very Richard move.
A very Richard move.
Richard had been married before. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, had died in 1395. There's this story which you unpick brilliantly in your book, that when Anne of Bohemia, Richard's first wife, died, that he sort of had this sort of fit of histrionics, was terribly kind of grieved by her death, tore down palaces that enjoyed together, swore never to set foot in them. How much of that is true? How much of it, if it is true, is Richard's performing grief? How much of it did he actually have a partnership with Anne of Bohemia?
He had a partnership in the sense that she was very quiet, very dutiful, very compliant. So she was exactly the kind of queen he wanted, who would follow him around meekly and say, yes, Richard, to everything he suggested. This terrible grief, she died at the Palace of Sheen on the river to the west of London. And he did have the palace taken down and all the materials that had been dismantled from it put into storage for a new palace that he was planning to build just a little way away at Isleworth. So it wasn't quite the raze it to the ground, I can't bear to look at it. And actually, if you look in detail, he'd already embarked on the plan to go to Ireland at the point where she died. And there was absolutely no interruption to that other than, let's pause for the most spectacular funeral you've ever seen, because Richard loved theatre. And this was a big piece of theatre, Anne's funeral, and then straight off to Ireland. And actually, if you look at his behaviour throughout that whole period, he seems energised. He loves it going to Ireland. He writes back happily to his council saying, it's marvellous here, it's absolutely beautiful, and all the Irish lords are recognising my authority exactly as they should. So there's no sign of a man who has been prostrated and incapacitated by grief. This is a man who loves drama with himself at its centre, and he immediately starts negotiating for his next wife, who turns out to be the 6-year-old Princess of France.
There is a sense, isn't there, that Richard would have been a very good reality TV star. At the funeral of, this love of drama, this absolute obsession with being the centre of attention. At Anne of Bohemia's funeral, he attacks one of the English lords.
He does. The Earl of Arundel, who has been one of the leading figures who criticised him, along with Thomas of Woodstock in 1386 to 1388. Arundel's a very belligerent man, extremely frustrated with Richard, and Richard loathes him. So when Arundel turns up late to Queen Anne's funeral, not a wise move, Richard seizes a staff of office from one of his attendants and beats Arundel to the ground, beats him round the head until there's blood on the flagstones in Westminster Abbey, which of course means that the priests of the Abbey have to immediately start cleaning it up and do a special rite to re-sanctify the now polluted space, and the funeral goes on for hours longer than it should. Richard is always performing. And there's this sense that no one else is fully real to him. His wishes, his feelings occupy the entire space in which he lives. Perhaps De Vere, the one other person that he sees as fully three-dimensional, but everyone else are props in his drama. And when they don't cooperate with what he thinks the drama should be, that's when his absolute rage is unleashed.
So sort of narcissism, solipsism, a bunch of other isms as well.
Exactly.
Not long after this, and perhaps in retrospect, it's not that surprising if you have a king who, by the way, is a powerful man. We should say this, that Richard, for all of sort of foppery, is a big guy.
He's 6 foot tall. We know he loves hunting. He does not like the physical aspects of either fighting or, it seems, physical touch. He and Anne of Bohemia have had no children. He then chooses to marry a small child. It seems
the handkerchief. He famously invents the handkerchief.
He and his tailor, or the man who organises his clothes and accessories, seem to have come up with the idea of a fine piece of linen with fine hems that he can carry in his hand in order to dab at his nose if need be. Now, there is not yet a word for such a piece of cloth, but it's there in his accounts, carefully described. So there's a real sense of fastidiousness. He's very concerned with hygiene. He has beautiful bathrooms installed at various of his palaces. And someone who is later tried for inappropriate and treacherous speech against the king is said to have said that the king was a useless ruler and should stay in his latrine for the rest of his days. Now, that could just be general rudeness, or it could be that Richard's keenness on hygiene and fine bathrooms had become known among his people. There's a sense that physicality was not his preferred mode. And that is a problem when your kingdom has been at war and your people need you to lead them in an active way. But there isn't really a sense that Richard sees kingship as something that is a doing word. It's a being word for him. He wants to be, and he wants his subjects to be at peace, by which he means hanging on his every word and preparing to obey every single thing he says.
So we have a narcissistic, germaphobe, drama-obsessed, strongman type leader.
I think
a very modern character in many ways. Let's bring this to 1397. 1395, you have Richard at a point where he's physically attacking other members of the nobility in public. Perhaps when we then look at the course of his reign, it isn't that surprising that within 2 years he's turned that into a matter of general policy. Can you tell us what happens to launch the great crisis of Richard's reign?
1397 is a very interesting and complex year. Richard has just come back from this great summit meeting with the King of France, the glorious peace that he has negotiated. A truce, but for long enough that we don't have to worry about the war starting again. And he, with his little bride, he's acquired an enormous dowry, piles of French gold. So at this point, Richard thinks everything is set fair. Surely now he will be able to do exactly as he pleases. He's not going to get nagged about the war. He has lots of money. He comes back to England and discovers there are still problems. His parliament doesn't want to do all the things he's just arranged with his friend, the King of France, which includes sending an army to help the French fight in Italy, which strikes Richard as a glorious thing to do. His subjects are saying, well, fine, but we're not going to pay for that. Why would we pay for that? He's also decided that he would like to become Holy Roman Emperor.
Who wouldn't?
Who wouldn't?
Well, I mean, and this office had been offered to Edward III, his grandfather, who perhaps wisely had turned it down.
There are reasons to turn it down. Getting embroiled in continental politics when you have a suspicion that the people who are asking you to become embroiled in continental politics might have their own reasons for doing so. Richard just thinks, that sounds marvellous. I would love to
crown,
be
how wonderful.
An even bigger and better crown. So by the summer of 1397, he's beginning to suspect that things are not going quite as he wishes, which must mean that someone is plotting against him. And if someone is plotting against him, well, it must be the lords who caused him such trouble 10 years earlier. And now he's in a position to do something about it. So that July, he launches what is in effect a coup within his own kingdom to arrest and destroy, it turns out, his uncle Thomas of Woodstock, the Duke of Gloucester, and the Earls of Arundel and Warwick, who were the leading lights of the crisis 10 years earlier. He initially says they are plotting against me again. They're not.
So in 1397, Richard has to look back to the events of 10 years previously.
He does. He revives that narrative in order now to charge the nobles he holds responsible for that terrible crisis, terrible from his point of view, with treason. He destroys the Earl of Arundel, who is tried as a traitor and executed. The Earl of Warwick begs in tears on his knees in Parliament for his life, which pleases Richard enormously. He is exiled to the Isle of Man and imprisoned for the rest of his life. But most shockingly, Thomas of Woodstock, his uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, who has been sent to prison in Calais, dies mysteriously behind closed doors in Calais. And the news leaks out. It gradually becomes clear that Woodstock has in fact been murdered. These are absolutely shocking events. We have to remember that it was not normal for a king of England to destroy leading members of his nobility. It hadn't happened for decades since the crises of Edward II's reign.
Well, and in a sense, Richard's grandfather, Edward III's reign, was certainly the first half of it was entirely about resetting the norms of politics back from a situation where the king was sort of slaughtering his relatives, his nobles, and then being slaughtered by them.
The shock to the political community is profound, and particularly to the two remaining members of the five lords who had led the opposition to Richard in 1387 to 88. That is his cousin Henry and another man called Thomas Mowbray, because they're okay so far, but if Richard has destroyed the other three, what is going to happen to them? And that's where we get to the beginning of Shakespeare's story. They accuse each other of treason, those two, in their panic, in their fear. Richard says they must fight a duel. Richard then stops the duel at the key moment when they're about to fight and exiles them both. With Henry in exile, Gaunt then dies. Richard seizes the Duchy of Lancaster for himself, and that's the point at which Henry realises he's going to have to do something to preserve his dynasty, his legacy, his inheritance, and the Kingdom of England. Because if Richard can take the greatest noble inheritance in the entire kingdom for himself on a whim, without law, without justification, he could do that to anyone. So when Henry comes back to claim his inheritance, the whole kingdom rallies to him, and it becomes clear that Richard is going to have to be deposed.
There are some important pieces to unpack here, one of which is that Richard by this stage has reconceived of what he thinks kingship ought to look like, on a domestic kingship at any rate, on a practical level. And it's no longer this idea that was so carefully designed or at least reinvigorated by Edward III, which is the king is in partnership with his nobles. He's not the first among equals, but he does recognise that there is a community of politics to mesh together. Richard has started to see himself as the greatest nobleman in the kingdom, effectively, hasn't he?
I think he thinks he should effectively be the only power in the kingdom. And what that means is that he has started building up a private, in effect, army, but a private retinue like the ones that his nobles have at their disposal, the Edward III idea being that the king at the head of this hierarchy should be able to call on his nobles, who are his greatest supporters, and they then call on the retinues of men who serve them, so that through this chain of command, the whole kingdom should be at the king's disposal. But Richard has never accepted that his nobles should have that power under his crown. So Richard wants a power that is only his. He's built up a retinue of his own based in the northwest, in his earldom of Chester, which he has now turned into a principality, a sort of citadel, a military citadel within his own kingdom. And his retinue of Cheshire archers and Cheshire knights is a private army on English soil. Now, why would a king of England need his own army on English soil when he's not at war with anyone else? He's also doing things like proclaiming a general pardon for all of his subjects, apart from 50 people who he refuses to name. Now, who are those people? Is it you? Is it me? Do we have to sue for a special pardon just in case? But if we do, are we admitting that we're guilty of something? It's a policy of Richard thinking that he will only be secure if all his subjects are insecure forever and at his mercy constantly, which makes him feel powerful, makes him feel he's finally in control as he always should have been, but is totally unsustainable.
Well, and at the same time is it's obvious even to the extended bodyguard, and we should say that kings of England have long had a bodyguard.
A bodyguard,
sergeant
absolutely,
of arms who
yeah.
can go out and do things. But this is blowing it up to sort of Wagner Group mercenary army status. But they say to him, don't they? Sleep. They call him Dickon, as his name. Sleep softly.
While we wake, we'll look after you. Don't you worry, we're here. And in return, Richard is letting them get away with almost anything. And they are swaggering through the streets of London when Parliament meets in 1397 in a sort of temporary tent because he's busy rebuilding Westminster Hall. He's full of grand artistic and architectural plans. He has his Cheshire archers stationed all the way around this tent with their bows in their hands. What message is that sending to his people? There is an atmosphere of intense paranoia, fear. What does the king intend to do next? If he can destroy Henry of Lancaster, the son of John of Gaunt, who's just died, the greatest nobleman in the country and his own cousin, it's a reign of terror, an out-and-out reign of terror, and no one is going to be able to feel safe.
Including Richard himself, of course, because here is the classic strongman trap. We see time and time again in history that the more power is concentrated on one person, that in a sense, the more kind of mighty and despotic they can be. But of course, the more terrified they tend to become, and they retreat and retreat. This is unsustainable, completely unsustainable. And when Richard effectively steals the inheritance of Henry Bolingbroke, Henry of Lancaster, the son of John of Gaunt, the heir to the greatest set of earldoms in the kingdom, he's shown his hand and in a sense really provokes his own end. Do you see it that way, that he's the architect of his own demise?
He's absolutely the architect of his own demise. And you're right that, of course, he is now locked into a reign of terror that enforces terror on himself as well, except that in that moment of triumph, he does seem to feel enough triumph that he decides to leave England. He takes his army, his wonderful private army, and all the nobles who are most closely associated with this new version of his regime, he takes them off to Ireland again, where a little bit of more trouble has been brewing and where he feels he's had this great military, majestic triumph before, thereby leaving England wide open for Henry to come back. Now, Henry doesn't come back at the head of an army. Henry's been in exile in Paris with a household, a very magnificent household, as befits such a great nobleman, but it's by no stretch of the imagination an army. He comes back with a few men around him and lands at Ravenspur in Yorkshire and starts moving through England, through the castles of the Duchy of Lancaster. He sends out summonses and people flock to his banner. Not only the people with established relationships with the Duchy of Lancaster, but people who should have been fighting for the noble men that Richard had left at home to keep an eye on the kingdom while he was off in Ireland. There are men turning up to collect wages from the king's treasury and then slipping off to join Henry. And great noblemen are among them, including the Percys, the greatest family in the north, apart from Henry's own family, who rally to his side. So by the time Richard manages to scramble enough ships, by the time the message has got to Ireland and Richard manages to scramble enough ships to get home to Wales, first of all, England has already fallen. And that is an indication of how badly Richard has misunderstood the entire project of his kingship. He thought it was the most secure fortress of an edifice that he could have built. And instead it was a house of cards and I'm tumbling down.
And there's a sense with Richard that even, I mean, it's clear at this point he has to be deposed. He's like Edward II. He is incorrigible. He's proven, people have been considered before. It's obvious that he has to be deposed. The question of who should replace him is a difficult one, but I think when we talk about Henry IV, we can discuss that. There is this sense with Richard that he is still, even at his moment of gravest crisis, when he's about to be deposed, completely blind to who's caused all this trouble. And one of the scenes I've always thought Shakespeare gets closest to historical accuracy with is that famous scene from Richard II, where he's sort of moping, "For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings, how some have been deposed," and so on and so forth. He ends up in that soliloquy of Shakespeare's blaming England, and that's drawn from the chronicler Adam Usk, who really did go and see Richard.
He was sent to visit Richard in his prison quarters in the Tower to try to assess his state of mind, and he found Richard ruminating on what a fickle world and a fickle kingdom England was, that had destroyed so many great men, thinking back through history. And it's a very powerful moment because it's such a strong indication that Richard had no resources at all. I mean, internal resources, personal resources. He had this brittle magnificence, this sort of carapace of kingship that he had constructed for himself. But it was so brittle that it was fragile. And the minute it was struck, it fractured. So he could rage. When the message first reached him in Ireland that Henry had come back, he raged against the perfidy of this cousin who was not obeying his commands. But as soon as it became clear that he was not going to be able to resist, he didn't know what to do. His rage collapsed then into fear and grief, but blaming God, blaming his subjects, blaming anyone except himself. He had done everything he should. He was righteous. He had been king. He had commanded his people. And once his words stopped having an effect, he had no strategy left. So in the end, there's a real pathos to him in the Tower in the end. The last glimpse we get of him in the Tower is when he's forced to abdicate along the model of Edward II, because how do you depose a king? God has anointed him. You need a belt and braces and every other possible bit of equipment you can to lever him off the throne. And when a deputation is finally sent to tell him that he has indeed been deposed and abdicated and is no longer king, so no one will obey him anymore, he says, I do not look for that. I just hope my cousin will be good lord to me. He's got nothing left at all.
Thought he was the Messiah, and he turned out just to be a very naughty boy. Was there anything we can say for Richard? If we're thinking about the legacy of Richard II, and of course we have to think about the legacy of Richard II in political terms when we look at Henry IV, Henry V, and in fact, really the whole of the 15th century. This personal grandeur, this love of fine things and architecture has left its mark, physically on the fabric of England, particularly in Westminster, hasn't it?
It has. Richard, certainly as a patron, was brilliant. The art and the architecture that he left behind are unparalleled in medieval England. And the particular examples that we should point to, Westminster Hall, which is the one, not quite the only, but the greatest remaining part of the medieval Palace of Westminster that otherwise burnt down in 1834. He remodelled a room that had originally been built in 1100 to add this fantastic hammer beam roof that you can still see if you do a tour of the Palace of Westminster, which I think everybody should. But also then Westminster Abbey. There are two things in Westminster Abbey. Richard's tomb that he commissioned after Anne of Bohemia died. He certainly had no intention of dying then, but commissioning the tomb meant he could make sure it was sufficiently blingy, and he could also write his own epitaph, which of course is something any self-respecting king should enjoy doing. And he also commissioned a life-size portrait of himself, which is just inside the entrance, the main west door of, it's not actually the door you go in, but the main west door of Westminster Abbey now. And it's an extraordinary painting, very, very fine image of the king as if at his coronation, although we know he was crowned at 10, against a gorgeous gold background. But the most exquisite piece is usually in the National Gallery. As we speak, it's in the Ashmolean, but we'll come back to the National Gallery. The Wilton diptych, which is one of the most exquisite pieces of art I've ever seen. A portable altarpiece that Richard commissioned for his own use that folds, it's hinged and folds in half, and on its left side it's small, it's exquisitely painted. The kneeling figure of Richard is presented by his patron saints John the Baptist and the Saint Kings of England, Edward the Confessor and Edmund the Martyr, to the Virgin and Infant Christ on the right-hand panel, with the ranks of angels, some of them looking slightly bored by the whole experience, I must say, but beautifully, beautifully painted, all wearing celestial blue and wearing on their breasts Richard's badge of the White Hart. He's pinned his own badge to the angels in heaven because that's how far he saw the reach of his own sovereignty.
History, I think, is always interesting when we're looking at people who are the best at something and the worst at something. Do you think Richard II was the worst of the Plantagenet kings? He's got to be in the running.
He's certainly in the running. I think for the sheer grandeur of his worstness, I think he liked prizes, so I think perhaps we ought to give him the prize. It was so deliberate, it was so sustained, it was so thoroughgoing, and he so incorrigibly refused to learn any lessons at all, despite years and years and years of people trying in various ways to show him a different way. The grandeur of Richard's terribleness, I think, does deserve some kind of prize. Well,
Helen, it's always enjoyable talking to you about Plantagenet kings. We've been doing it for a very long time now. We're going to be talking next in this short series about Henry IV, so I look forward to doing that.
Me too. Thank you.